The winter wind cut through her jacket like it wasn't even there. She pulled it tighter anyway, more out of habit than hope. The temperature had dropped below freezing 2 hours ago, and her fingers had gone numb long before that. She was 24 years old, and she had been living on the streets of Chicago for almost 8 months. Her name was Elena, and 3 years ago, she had been one of the most promising young pianists in the country. Now she was just another face that people looked past on the sidewalk. Another person they pretended not to see. That afternoon, she wasn't looking for anything special. She just needed to get warm. The shelter didn't open until 6, and it was barely 3 o'clock. 3 more hours in this cold could be dangerous. She had learned that lesson the hard way during her first winter on the streets. So, when she saw the golden light spilling out from the revolving doors of the Hartwell Grand Hotel, she didn't think twice. She just walked in. The warmth hit her like a wave. She stopped just inside the entrance, letting the heat sink into her bones. The lobby was enormous, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers and fresh flowers arranged on tables that probably cost more than she had ever earned in a year. Everything was polished and perfect. Everything smelled like money. She knew she didn't belong here. She could feel the stares from the guests in their expensive coats, the slight turn of heads, the way people created distance without seeming to move at all. She had become an expert at reading these signals, the ones that said you are not one of us. But she didn't leave, not yet. Just a few more minutes of warmth. That's all she needed, and then she saw it. In the center of the lobby, set on a small raised platform, was a grand piano. It was a Steinway, jet black and gleaming under the soft lights. It was roped off with velvet cords, clearly just for decoration, clearly not meant to be touched. Elena stopped breathing. She hadn't touched a piano in 3 years, not since everything fell apart, not since she had to sell her own keyboard just to pay for another week of her mother's medication, not since the music that had defined her entire life went silent. But seeing this piano now, something stirred inside her, something she thought had died a long time ago. She moved closer without meaning to. Her feet carried her across the marble floor, past the front desk, past the seating area where businessmen typed on laptops and women sipped champagne. She stopped just outside the velvet rope and stared at the keys. Her hands trembled, not from the cold this time, from memory, from longing. She could almost feel the weight of the keys beneath her fingers. She could almost hear the music that had once flowed through her as naturally as breathing. Chopin, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, all those hours of practice, all those competitions, all those people who had told her she was special, that she had a gift, that she was going to be somebody. Where had all of that gone? A voice cut through her thoughts. Well, that's certainly a sight. The voice was loud, confident, and dripping with amusement. Elena turned to see a man standing about 20 feet away near the front desk. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was talking to a younger man beside him, but his eyes were fixed on Elena. I suppose anyone can just wander in these days, the older man continued, not bothering to lower his voice. Looks like security is sleeping on the job. The younger man laughed nervously. A few guests nearby glanced over and smiled, the way people do when someone powerful makes a joke and they want to be on the right side of it. Elena's face burned. She knew exactly what she looked like. Her jacket was stained and worn at the elbows. Her jeans had holes that weren't fashionable. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail because she hadn't had access to a proper shower in days. She was carrying everything she owned in a backpack that was falling apart at the seams. She looked homeless because she was homeless. The older man said something else to his companion, something quieter this time, but Elena caught the words anyway. Can't have that touching the piano. Get someone to handle it. That? Not her. Not even this woman or this person. That, like she was garbage someone had forgotten to throw away. The younger man was already signaling to a security guard near the entrance. Elena saw the guard start walking toward her, his expression neutral, but his intention clear. She would be asked to leave. Politely, probably, but firmly, because she didn't belong in this beautiful lobby with its beautiful piano and its beautiful people. She should have walked away. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing. She had learned a long time ago that fighting back only made things worse when you had nothing. But something inside her wouldn't move. Maybe it was the way that man had laughed. Maybe it was the word "that" echoing in her head. Maybe it was 3 years of silence, of grief, of watching everything she had ever loved slip through her fingers like water. Or maybe it was the piano. That beautiful, perfect, untouchable piano that was just sitting there, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Before she could think about what she was doing, Elena stepped over the velvet rope. A woman nearby gasped. The security guard quickened his pace. The silver-haired man stopped talking mid-sentence, his eyebrows rising in disbelief. Elena sat down on the bench. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her. The keys stretched out before her. 88 of them, black and white, waiting. She placed her hands on the keyboard, and for a moment, she just held them there. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What was she doing? This was insane. She was going to get arrested. She was going to make everything worse. But then her fingers found the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, and everything else disappeared. The first phrase floated up from the piano like a question, soft and searching. Elena's fingers moved on their own, guided by years of training that her body had never forgotten, even when her mind had tried to let go. The notes came slowly at first, tentatively, like she was remembering a language she hadn't spoken in a long time. But then something shifted. The music took over. It rose and fell, whispered and roared. Carried her away from the marble lobby and the staring faces and the security guard who had frozen in his tracks. She wasn't homeless anymore. She wasn't broken. She wasn't invisible. She was a pianist. She was playing the piece that had won her first national competition at 16. The piece her professor at Juilliard had called her signature. The piece she had played for her mother in the hospital on a borrowed keyboard during those final weeks when nothing else could reach her. The music filled the lobby. It bounced off the marble walls and climbed toward the crystal chandeliers. It stopped conversations and turned heads and made people forget whatever they had been doing just moments before. And the man who had laughed at her, the one in the expensive suit who had called her that. He stood completely still, his mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face, because he knew talent when he heard it, and what he was hearing now was something he hadn't expected, something extraordinary. Something that made him feel, for the first time in a very long time, that he had made a terrible mistake. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed. She was lost in the music, lost in the memory of who she used to be and the faint, flickering hope of who she might become again. She played on, unaware that everything was about to change. The music poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. Elena had forgotten what this felt like, the way her fingers seemed to move without her telling them to, the way the rest of the world just melted away until there was nothing left but the sound. For 3 years, she had been carrying around a silence inside her chest, and now that silence was finally breaking. The Chopin Ballade was one of the hardest pieces in the classical piano repertoire. It demanded everything from a performer: technical precision, emotional depth, the ability to tell a story without words. Elena had spent 2 years perfecting it before her life fell apart. She had played it in concert halls and competition stages. She had played it for professors who told her she was destined for greatness. But she had never played it like this. Maybe it was the pain. Maybe it was everything she had lost. Maybe it was the humiliation of being laughed at by a man who didn't even see her as human. Whatever it was, it poured into the music and transformed it into something raw and real and almost unbearable to hear. The opening section was gentle, almost hesitant, like someone looking back at a memory they weren't sure they wanted to remember. Elena's fingers danced over the keys, pulling out notes that seemed to hang in the air like questions without answers. Then the music began to build. The melody grew stronger, more insistent. The left hand drove forward with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat getting faster. The right hand soared above it, spinning out phrases that climbed higher and higher until they seemed ready to break. People in the lobby had stopped moving. A businessman who had been typing furiously on his laptop let his hands fall still. A couple who had been arguing quietly near the elevators turned to watch, their disagreement forgotten. A mother pulled her young daughter closer and whispered something in her ear, pointing at the woman at the piano. The security guard who had been walking toward Elena was now standing frozen about 10 feet away. He had his hand raised like he was about to say something, but no words came out. He just stood there, listening. Even the staff behind the front desk had stopped what they were doing. One of them, a young woman with her hair pinned up in a neat bun, had tears forming in her eyes. She didn't know why. The music just did that to her. And then there was the man who had laughed. Richard Hartwell III, owner of this hotel and 12 others like it across the country. One of the wealthiest men in Chicago, a man who was used to being the most important person in any room he walked into. He hadn't moved since Elena started playing. His companion, the younger man in the expensive tie, was staring at Richard with confusion. He had never seen his boss look like this. Richard Hartwell always had something to say. He always had an opinion, a comment, a joke. But right now, he was completely silent. His face had gone pale, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. The music reached its climax. Elena's hands flew across the keyboard, pulling out cascades of notes that crashed over each other like waves in a storm. The sound filled every corner of the massive lobby. It bounced off the marble floors and echoed against the high ceiling. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, the kind of music that made you feel things you had been trying not to feel. And then, just as suddenly as it had built, the storm began to calm. The final section of the ballade was quieter, more reflective. Like the moment after you've cried yourself empty and you're just sitting there, wondering what comes next. Elena played these final passages with her eyes still closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, completely lost in the world she had created. The last note hung in the air for what felt like forever. And then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Elena opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was seeing. There were people everywhere, dozens of them. Maybe 50 or more. They had gathered around the piano without her noticing, forming a loose semicircle that stretched almost to the front desk. They were all looking at her. A woman in the front was openly crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. A man in a business suit was shaking his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he had just witnessed. The young girl with her mother was staring at Elena with wide eyes, her mouth hanging open. And then someone started clapping. It was slow at first, just one person, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire lobby erupted in applause. The sound was deafening. People were cheering, whistling, stamping their feet. Someone shouted "Bravo" from somewhere near the back. The young woman behind the front desk was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt, tears still streaming down her face. Elena sat frozen on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. She had forgotten what this felt like, too. The applause, the recognition, the feeling of being seen. For 8 months, she had been invisible. People walked past her on the street like she wasn't there. They avoided eye contact. They pretended she didn't exist. And now, suddenly, all these people were looking at her like she mattered, like she was someone worth paying attention to. It was almost too much to bear. She stood up quickly, suddenly very aware of how she must look. Her worn jacket, her dirty backpack, her unwashed hair. She didn't belong here. She wasn't supposed to be here. She needed to leave before something bad happened. But before she could step away from the piano, a voice cut through the applause. Wait. It wasn't loud, but somehow Elena heard it clearly. She turned toward the sound. Richard Hartwell was walking toward her. The crowd parted for him automatically, the way crowds always do for men like him. His face was different now. The mocking smile was gone. The superior look in his eyes had disappeared. He looked like a man who had just been hit with something he wasn't prepared for. Elena's heart started pounding again. This was it. This was when security would grab her and drag her out. This was when she would get arrested for trespassing or vandalism or whatever they wanted to charge her with. She had been stupid. So stupid. One moment of defiance was about to cost her everything. Richard stopped a few feet away from her. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Really looked. Like he was seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was quiet. There was no mockery in it now, no superiority, just genuine confusion and something else. Something that might have been wonder. Elena didn't know what to say. Who was she? She didn't even know anymore. She was nobody. She was a ghost. She was a woman who used to be something and now was nothing. But that wasn't what came out of her mouth. "I'm a pianist," she said. The words surprised her. She hadn't called herself that in 3 years. She had stopped believing she had the right to that title the day she played her mother's favorite song at the funeral, and then walked away from music forever. But standing here now, with the echo of Chopin still ringing in her ears and the applause of strangers still warming her chest, she realized something. The music had never really left her. It had just been waiting. Richard Hartwell studied her for another long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching, including himself. He nodded toward his office. "I think," he said slowly, "that you and I need to talk." Elena hesitated. Every instinct she had developed on the streets was screaming at her to run. Rich men didn't help people like her. There was always a catch. There was always something they wanted. But something in his eyes made her pause. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like a man who had just had the ground shift beneath his feet. A man who had just realized he might have been wrong about something important. So against her better judgment, Elena followed him. She had no idea that this moment, this single decision to walk into a stranger's office instead of running away, would change the entire course of her life. Richard Hartwell's office was on the top floor of the hotel. Elena followed him into an elevator that was nicer than most apartments she had ever lived in. The walls were polished wood, the floor was marble, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored ceiling and quickly looked away. She didn't want to see what she had become. Neither of them spoke during the ride up. When the doors opened, Richard led her down a hallway lined with paintings that probably cost more than most houses. They passed a secretary who looked up with surprise, her eyes moving from her boss to the homeless woman trailing behind him. She opened her mouth to say something, but Richard held up a hand without even looking at her. "Hold my calls," he said. "All of them." His office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Chicago skyline, the city stretching out below like a kingdom. There were leather couches, a massive wooden desk, and shelves lined with awards and photographs and expensive-looking objects that Elena couldn't identify. But none of that caught her attention. What caught her attention was the piano. In the corner of the office, near the windows, sat a smaller grand piano. It was beautiful, with a rich mahogany finish that gleamed in the afternoon light. Unlike the one in the lobby, this piano looked used, loved. There were small scratches on the bench, the kind that come from years of someone sitting down and standing up. Sitting down and standing up. Richard noticed her looking at it. "That was my daughter's," he said quietly. Elena turned to face him. There was something different in his voice now, something heavy. He walked over to a small bar in the corner and poured himself a drink. He didn't offer her one. He just stood there for a moment, his back to her, staring out at the city. "Her name was Catherine," he continued. "She started playing when she was 4. By the time she was 12, her teachers were telling me she was gifted. By 15, she was talking about Juilliard, about concert halls, about dedicating her life to music." He took a long sip of his drink. "I didn't understand it. I'm a businessman. I understand money, deals, numbers. Music was always just noise to me. Beautiful noise, maybe, but noise. I never really got why she loved it so much." Elena stayed silent. She sensed that he wasn't really talking to her. He was talking to himself, or maybe to someone who wasn't there anymore. "She died when she was 19. The words hung in the air like a weight. Richard turned around to face Elena. His eyes were red, but he wasn't crying. He looked like a man who had done all his crying a long time ago and had nothing left. "Car accident," he said. "Some drunk driver ran a red light. She was on her way home from a recital. The doctor said she didn't suffer. I don't know if that's true or if they just say that to make people feel better." Elena felt something twist in her chest. She knew grief. She knew what it was like to lose someone so completely that the world stopped making sense. "I'm sorry," she said. It was all she could think to say. Richard shook his head. "It was 7 years ago. You'd think it would get easier. Everyone tells you it gets easier. They're lying." He set his drink down and walked over to the mahogany piano. He ran his fingers along the top of it, gently, like he was touching something sacred. "I had this moved up here after she passed. I couldn't stand to look at it, but I couldn't get rid of it either. No one has played it since she died." He turned to look at Elena. "Until I heard you downstairs, I had forgotten what it sounded like when someone really played, when someone put their whole soul into the music." He paused. "You play like she did, like the music is the only thing that matters." Elena didn't know what to say. She had walked into this office expecting to be yelled at, threatened, maybe handed over to the police. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected grief that mirrored her own. "Sit down," Richard said, gesturing to one of the leather couches. "Please." Elena hesitated, then sat. The leather was soft and cool. She felt out of place, like a stain on something pristine. Richard sat across from her in a matching chair. He studied her face for a long moment before speaking again. "Now," he said, "tell me who you really are. And I don't mean your name, I mean your story. How does someone who plays like that end up—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Elena looked down at her hands. They were rough now, the skin cracked from cold and hard living. But they were still a pianist's hands, long fingers, strong joints, hands that had once been her most valuable possession. "I was a student at Juilliard," she said quietly. 3 years ago." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I got in when I was 16, full scholarship. My professor said I was one of the most talented students he had ever taught. I was on track to graduate early to start performing professionally, to have the career I had dreamed about since I was a little girl." She paused, the memories washing over her like cold water. "Then my mother got sick." She told him everything. How her mother had been diagnosed with cancer right before Elena's junior year. How Elena had taken a leave of absence to care for her, thinking it would only be for a semester, maybe 2. How the medical bills had piled up faster than she could count them. How she had sold everything she owned, including her beloved keyboard, just to keep up with the payments. She told him about the long nights in hospital rooms, holding her mother's hand while machines beeped and hummed, about watching the strongest woman she had ever known fade away piece by piece, about the morning she walked into the hospital room and found it empty, the bed stripped, the flowers gone. "She passed 2 years ago," Elena said, "and after that, I just fell apart." She explained how she had tried to go back to school, but her scholarship was gone and she couldn't afford the tuition. How she had taken odd jobs to pay rent, but the debt kept growing. How she had been evicted from her apartment 6 months later. How she had spent one night on a park bench, then another, until somehow she had become someone who lived on the streets. "I stopped playing after my mother died," she said. "I couldn't. Every time I touched a piano, I heard her voice telling me how proud she was. And I couldn't handle that. So I just stopped." She looked up at Richard. "Today was the first time I've played in 3 years. I don't even know why I did it. I just saw that piano and something in me broke. Or maybe something in me finally healed. I don't know." The office was silent for a long moment. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't looking at her with pity. Elena had learned to recognize pity. It was the look people gave you before they walked away and forgot about you. This was something different. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he said finally. Elena shook her head. "I see someone who gave up everything for love, who sacrificed her dreams to take care of someone she loved. That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's the most human thing a person can do." He leaned forward. "And I see someone with a gift. A real gift. The kind that doesn't come along very often. The kind that shouldn't be wasted sleeping in shelters and wandering the streets." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. She had learned not to cry in front of strangers. It made you vulnerable. It made you a target. "What are you saying?" she asked. Richard stood up and walked over to the window. He looked out at the city for a long moment before turning back to face her. "I'm saying that I laughed at you today. I looked at you and saw nothing but a problem to be removed. And then you sat down at that piano and showed me how wrong I was." He paused. "I'd like to make that right, if you'll let me." Elena stared at him, not understanding, not daring to hope. "What do you mean?" Richard smiled. It was a small smile, tired and sad, but genuine. "I mean that I think we can help each other. And I think my daughter would have wanted me to try." Elena didn't trust it. Not at first. Richard's offer was simple. He would pay for a small apartment, cover her living expenses, and give her access to practice facilities for 1 year. In return, she would perform at private events in his hotels and, when she was ready, audition for a professional position somewhere. Anywhere she wanted. It sounded too good to be true. And Elena had learned the hard way that things that sounded too good to be true usually were. "Why?" she asked him that first day in his office. "You don't know me. I'm nobody to you. Why would you do this?" Richard had looked at her with those tired, sad eyes. "Because my daughter would have been around your age now," he said. "And because I spent the last 7 years building hotels and making money and trying to fill a hole that can't be filled. Maybe helping you won't fix anything, but at least it's something real." Elena had wanted to say no. Every instinct she had built up on the streets screamed at her to walk away. Rich people didn't help homeless people without wanting something in return. There was always a cost. Always. But then she thought about the piano, about the way it had felt to play again after 3 years of silence, about the music that had poured out of her like it had been trapped inside, waiting to escape. And she said yes. The first few months were the hardest. Richard set her up in a small apartment near downtown. It wasn't fancy, just one bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom that actually had hot water. To Elena, it felt like a palace. She spent the first night just sitting on the bed, running her hands over the clean sheets, unable to believe this was real. He also connected her with a woman named Mrs. Chen, a piano teacher who had once taught his daughter. Mrs. Chen was in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had trained concert pianists for over 40 years, and she did not believe in going easy on anyone. Their first lesson was a disaster. Elena sat down at the piano in Mrs. Chen's studio, confident that her muscle memory would carry her through. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play a simple Chopin etude, something she had mastered years ago. She made it through 8 bars before Mrs. Chen held up her hand. "Stop." Elena stopped, confused. "Your technique has deteriorated," Mrs. Chen said bluntly. "Your finger positioning is sloppy. Your timing is inconsistent. You're relying on emotion to cover up mistakes." Elena felt her face flush with shame. "I haven't played in 3 years. I just need to warm up." 3 years is nothing," Mrs. Chen said. "I've had students return after 10 years and play beautifully. The problem is not time. The problem is that you've forgotten how to work." The words stung, but Elena couldn't argue. She had forgotten. On the streets, survival was about getting through each day. Planning ahead, practicing, working toward a goal. These were luxuries she couldn't afford. She had lost the discipline that had once defined her. "We start from the beginning," Mrs. Chen said. "Scales, exercises, fundamentals. You will not play a single piece of real music until I say you're ready." Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to say that she had played at Juilliard, that she had won competitions, that she knew what she was doing. But she looked at Mrs. Chen's face and saw something there that stopped her. It wasn't cruelty. It was investment. Mrs. Chen wasn't tearing her down because she enjoyed it. She was tearing her down because she believed there was something worth rebuilding. So Elena swallowed her pride and went back to basics. For 3 months, she did nothing but scales and exercises. Her fingers ached. Her back hurt from sitting at the piano for hours. Some days, she wanted to give up so badly she could taste it. What was the point? She was 24 years old, starting over from scratch. Other pianists her age were performing in concert halls, building careers, living the life she had once dreamed of. She was practicing scales like a beginner. There were dark days, days when she couldn't get out of bed, days when the grief for her mother came crashing back like a wave and she couldn't breathe, days when she looked in the mirror and still saw the homeless woman in the dirty jacket, no matter how clean her clothes were now. On those days, she would sometimes call Richard, not to ask for anything, just to talk. He always answered, no matter how busy he was, and he always listened. "I feel like a fraud," she told him one night, sitting on the floor of her apartment with the phone pressed to her ear. "Everyone's expecting me to be this great pianist, and I can barely get through a simple exercise without making mistakes." "Who's everyone?" Richard asked. "I don't know. You, Mrs. Chen, the people who clapped for me in the lobby." "Those people clapped because they heard something real," Richard said. "They didn't hear perfect technique. They heard someone playing with their whole heart. That's what made them stop and listen." "But that's not enough," Elena said. "Heart isn't enough. You have to be good too." "So get good," Richard said simply. "You did it once. You can do it again. The only difference is that now you have something you didn't have before." "What's that?" "A second chance. Most people never get one. Don't waste yours." Elena hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what he said. The next morning, she went back to Mrs. Chen's studio and practiced for 6 hours straight. Slowly, things began to change. After 3 months of fundamentals, Mrs. Chen finally let her play real music again. Simple pieces at first. Mozart sonatas, Bach inventions, music that required precision and control rather than raw emotion. Then, gradually, harder pieces, Beethoven, Liszt, Rachmaninoff, music that pushed her technique to its limits and forced her to grow. 6 months after that afternoon in the hotel lobby, Elena could feel herself becoming a pianist again. Her fingers were stronger, her timing was sharper. The connection between her mind and her hands, which had been broken for so long, was finally healing. But the real test came when she wasn't expecting it. One evening, Richard called her with an unusual request. There was a private dinner at one of his hotels, a gathering of donors for a children's music charity. The performer they had booked had canceled at the last minute. Could Elena fill in? She almost said no. She wasn't ready. She hadn't performed in public since that day in the lobby. What if she froze? What if she made a fool of herself? But then she remembered something her mother used to tell her. The stage will always be scary. The only thing scarier is never getting on it. So she said yes. The night of the dinner, Elena walked into the ballroom in a simple black dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her pick out. There was a grand piano at the front of the room, surrounded by tables filled with wealthy donors in expensive clothes. She felt like an imposter, like at any moment someone would recognize her as the homeless woman from the lobby and ask her to leave. But no one did. She sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. She chose a piece by Debussy, something gentle and flowing, suitable for background music at a dinner. But as she played, something shifted. The conversations at the tables grew quieter. People began to turn toward the piano. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then came the applause. It wasn't like the explosion of sound in the hotel lobby. It was softer, more refined. But it was real. These people, with all their money and success, were applauding for her. Elena looked out at the crowd and saw Richard standing near the back of the room. He was clapping too, and there was something on his face she had never seen before. Pride. After the dinner, one of the guests approached her. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He handed her a business card. "I'm on the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra," he said. "We have an opening for an associate pianist position. Auditions are in 3 months. I think you should apply." Elena looked down at the card in her hand. 3 months ago, she had been sleeping in a shelter. Now she was holding an invitation to audition for one of the most prestigious orchestras in the country. She looked up at the man and smiled. "I'll be there," she said. The audition was held on a cold Tuesday morning in February. Elena arrived at the Chicago Symphony Center 2 hours early. She sat in her car, staring at the building through the windshield, her hands trembling in her lap. The car wasn't hers. Richard had lent it to her for the day. One more kindness in a year full of kindnesses she still wasn't sure she deserved. She thought about turning around, just driving away and pretending none of this had ever happened. She could go back to her little apartment, call Richard, tell him she wasn't ready. He would understand. He always understood. But then she thought about her mother. She thought about all those years of sacrifice, the extra shifts her mother had worked to pay for piano lessons, the used car she had driven for 15 years so Elena could have a better keyboard, the way her mother's face had lit up at every recital, every competition, every small victory along the way. Her mother had believed in her when no one else did. Her mother had seen something in her that was worth nurturing, worth sacrificing for, worth everything. Elena couldn't let that belief die. She got out of the car and walked into the building. The audition room was smaller than she expected. Just a stage with a grand piano, a table where 3 judges sat with notepads, and a handful of chairs for other candidates waiting their turn. There were 6 other pianists auditioning that day. Elena recognized none of them, but she could tell from their posture, their clothes, their confidence, that they belonged here. They had trained at the best schools, They had never had to sleep on the streets or sell their keyboards to pay for medicine. She was the outsider, the long shot, the girl who had no business being here. But she was here anyway. When her name was called, Elena walked to the piano on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her position, and placed her hands on the keys. The judges looked at her with polite, neutral expressions. They had seen hundreds of pianists. They were looking for something special, something that would make them sit up and pay attention. Elena closed her eyes. She thought about her mother, sitting in the front row of her very first recital, crying before Elena had even played a single note. She thought about Mrs. Chen, pushing her harder than anyone had ever pushed her, because she believed there was something worth pushing for. She thought about Richard, a stranger who had seen past her circumstances and given her a chance when he had no reason to. And she thought about that day in the hotel lobby, the laughter, the humiliation, the moment she had decided to sit down at that piano anyway, not because she thought it would change anything, but because the music inside her refused to stay silent any longer. She opened her eyes and began to play. She had chosen the same piece she had played in the lobby, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the piece that had started everything. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't playing out of desperation or defiance. She was playing because she had earned the right to be here. Every scale, every exercise, every hour of practice over the past year had led to this moment. She wasn't the broken woman who had stumbled into a hotel lobby looking for warmth. She was a pianist, a real one, and she was going to prove it. The music filled the room. It started soft, like a whisper, like a secret being shared. Then it grew, building in waves, each phrase more powerful than the last. Elena's fingers moved with precision and passion, technique and emotion woven together so tightly that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The judges stopped writing. One of them, a woman with gray hair and glasses, leaned forward in her chair. Another, a younger man in a suit, set down his pen entirely and just listened. The third, an older gentleman who had looked bored all morning, was now watching Elena with an expression of quiet amazement. The piece reached its climax, a cascade of notes that thundered through the room like a storm. Then it softened, slowing into the final passages, gentle and reflective, like the calm after everything has been said and felt and released. The last note faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the woman with gray hair spoke. "Thank you," she said. "We'll be in touch." Elena nodded, stood up, and walked out of the room. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had no idea if she had done well or not. She had given everything she had. Now, all she could do was wait. The call came 3 days later. She had gotten the position. Elena stood in her apartment, holding the phone, unable to speak. The woman on the other end was saying something about schedules and rehearsals and welcome to the orchestra, but Elena couldn't process any of it. All she could think was, "I did it. Mom, I did it." She called Richard as soon as she hung up. He answered on the first ring. "I got it," she said, her voice breaking. "I got the position." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I knew you would," he said. "I knew it from the moment I heard you play." 1 year later, Elena performed her debut solo concert at the Chicago Symphony Center. The hall held 2,500 people, and every seat was filled. Critics from major newspapers were in attendance. Classical music lovers who had heard about the homeless pianist who had risen from nothing had come to see if the story was true. Elena stood backstage, wearing a beautiful gown that Mrs. Chen had helped her choose, listening to the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. She felt calm, ready. A stagehand approached her. 5 minutes, miss. Elena nodded. She took one last deep breath and thought about everyone who had brought her to this moment. Her mother, who had given her everything. Mrs. Chen, who had rebuilt her from the ground up. Richard, who had seen her when no one else did. And herself, the woman who had refused to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. The lights in the hall dimmed. The crowd fell silent. Elena walked onto the stage. The applause was immediate, a wave of sound that washed over her. She smiled, bowed, and walked to the piano. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the audience. In the front row, she saw Richard. He was dressed in a dark suit, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. And next to him, in the seat beside his, was a small framed photograph resting on the cushion. His daughter, Catherine. The girl who had loved the piano just like Elena did. The girl who never got to live her dream. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she didn't look away. She held Richard's gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them. Gratitude. Understanding. Love. Maybe. The kind of love that doesn't need words because it's been proven through actions, through sacrifice, through showing up when it mattered. She turned back to the piano and placed her hands on the keys. And then she began to play. The music that filled the hall that night was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It was joyful and heartbreaking, powerful and tender, full of everything Elena had lived through and everything she had overcome. It was the music of a woman who had lost everything and found herself again, a woman who had been laughed at, ignored, dismissed, and had risen anyway. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. It went on, wave after wave, until Elena lost count of how long she had been standing there, bowing, crying, laughing, overwhelmed by it all. But she wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at Richard, who was standing with tears streaming down his face, clapping harder than anyone. And she was looking at the empty seat beside him, where a young woman with a love for piano had never gotten to sit. Some music, Elena understood now, was never just about the player. It was about everyone who had believed in her along the way, and everyone who was listening.